In the vast, deceptively serene expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, American warships moved like silent sentinels beneath a cloudless sky. Their steel hulls sliced through the calm waters without a sound, like phantoms of a coming storm. These vessels, part of the United States Navy's Sixth Fleet, weren't just on patrol. They were making a statement, a deliberate and unyielding challenge etched not in ink on parchment, but in radar pings and sonar signatures, in the hum of engines and the flickering of battle monitors. The lines they traced across the ocean weren't cartographic. They were political. They were warnings. They were lines of confrontation. It was April 1986, and the world stood on the edge of something uncertain. In Washington, nerves were raw. Intelligence chatter hummed with urgency. And out at sea, in a swath of water that had long been disputed, American warships advanced southward toward an invisible but infamous boundary, Muammar Gaddafi's so-called line of death. Gaddafi, Libya's enigmatic and volatile leader, was not new to international controversy. For over a decade, he had fashioned himself as a revolutionary icon, a symbol of resistance against Western dominance and a vocal opponent of the United States. He wrapped himself in the rhetoric of anti-colonialism, pan-Arabism, and later pan-Africanism, calling for the unification of the Arab world under a new order, his order. But behind the fiery speeches and ideological posturing lay a cold, strategic calculus. Libya, under Gaddafi's command, had become one of the world's foremost sponsors of terrorism. From the bombing of a Berlin discotheque frequented by American servicemen to the arming of insurgent groups from Europe to Africa, Gaddafi's fingerprints were found wherever instability thrived. His regime funneled weapons, money, and training to a myriad of militant organizations, some leftist, others nationalist or religiously motivated, all united by a common enmity toward the West. But Gaddafi was not content to wage this shadow war through proxies alone. He also challenged American power more directly, none more provocatively than through his claims over the Gulf of Sidra. Though international law recognized territorial waters extending 12 nautical miles from a nation's coast, Gaddafi unilaterally claimed the entire Gulf, over 100 miles wide, as Libyan territory. In 1973, he drew a literal and figurative line across the sea, warning the world not to cross it. He called it the line of death, and with typical theatrical flair, vowed that any vessel trespassing south of that line would be met with deadly force. The United States, championing the principle of freedom of navigation, a cornerstone of international maritime law, saw Gaddafi's claim as an unacceptable affront. To allow one man, one regime, to impose unlawful restrictions on international waters would set a dangerous precedent. American naval operations in the region became more than routine patrols. They were deliberate assertions of legal rights and unmistakable shows of strength. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, these tensions simmered. There had already been skirmishes. In 1981, 2 Libyan Su-22 fighter jets fired on a U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcat during a freedom of navigation mission. Both Libyan planes were promptly shot down. The message was clear, but Gaddafi remained undeterred. And so, in April 1986, the stage was set for a confrontation long in the making. The American response was not improvised. It was calculated, methodical, and measured, but resolute. U.S. warships were dispatched to the Gulf of Sidra once more, their crews knowing full well that Gaddafi's forces would interpret their presence as a provocation. But to back down would be to concede, and to concede would be to invite further aggression, not just from Libya, but from every would-be challenger watching the situation unfold. There was tension not just at sea, but in the corridors of power across the globe. European allies watched nervously. The Soviet Union, still a global rival in the final years of the Cold War, eyed the Mediterranean theater with keen interest. Intelligence analysts on both sides sifted through satellite images, intercepted communications, and diplomatic cables, searching for signals in the static. Would this turn into a full-scale war? Or was it merely another chapter in the long, shadowy chess match of geopolitical brinkmanship? On board the American ships, sailors and aviators went through their drills with quiet intensity. Every radar lock, every sonar ping, every scrambled aircraft became a heartbeat in a growing rhythm of escalation. The Gulf of Sidra was more than a body of water. It had become a crucible for ideologies, a place where American resolve and Libyan defiance would collide. And beneath the Mediterranean sun, that collision was rapidly approaching. The world watched with bated breath. Journalists speculated, politicians postured, diplomats worked. Behind the scenes. But in the end, it would be the men aboard the ships and jets, the pilots, the gunners, the radar operators, who would bear the weight of the moment. As Gaddafi doubled down on his rhetoric and raised Libya's alert status, American warships pushed forward, crossing the line of death without hesitation. The fuse had been lit. The confrontation that had brewed for over a decade was finally about to ignite. The storm that was about to engulf Libya in fire and steel did not begin with warships or fighter jets. It did not originate in the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean, where the U.S. Navy prowled defiantly past imaginary lines drawn by dictators. No, the storm had its roots in something far darker, more insidious. It was born in the shadowy world of international terrorism, a web of violence and ideology that stretched from the back alleys of Belfast to the war-torn streets of Beirut. And at the heart of that web, bankrolling chaos with petrodollars and ideology, was Muammar Gaddafi. During the early 1980s, Libya transformed from a mere regional troublemaker into a global patron of terror. Gaddafi, flush with oil revenue and burning with anti-Western fervor, took it upon himself to export his vision of revolutionary upheaval by any means necessary. While he styled himself as a visionary, a prophet of third world liberation, the reality was far more brutal. Gaddafi's Libya became a sanctuary for rogue elements and extremist groups, factions that thrived in violence, that spoke the language of bombs, bullets, and blood. To radical Marxists in Europe, to separatists in the British Isles, and to militants in the Middle East, Gaddafi extended a lifeline: money, arms, safe haven. The Red Brigades in Italy, the Baader-Meinhof gang in West Germany, the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, Abu Nidal's Palestinian splinter faction all received support through Libyan intelligence channels. And as their bombs exploded in embassies, train stations, airports, and nightclubs, the world began to understand the cost of Gaddafi's ambitions. For the United States, these attacks were not just statistics on a government memo. They were personal. They struck at Americans abroad and undermined the security of allies. Intelligence agencies across Europe began sharing mounting evidence, intercepted messages, wiretaps, captured operatives, each pointing to Libya's central role in orchestrating and financing a continent-wide campaign of mayhem. But even as the Reagan administration monitored this escalating pattern of violence, there remained a sense of restraint. Sanctions were tightened, diplomatic condemnations were issued, covert operations were explored. Yet a full-scale military response remained off the table for a time. That all changed on the night of April 5, 1986. In West Berlin, the La Belle Discothèque was alive with music and laughter. It was a popular haunt for young people, locals, tourists, and American servicemen stationed in the divided city. On that fateful evening, the club was packed. Inside, the pulse of the music masked the ticking of a hidden terror. At precisely 1:45 a.m., a bomb detonated near the DJ booth. The blast was massive, ripping through concrete and flesh alike. Shrapnel tore into bodies. Smoke filled the room. Blood soaked the dance floor. In an instant, the club was transformed into a vision of hell. Lights shattered, screams echoing, limbs mangled. When the dust settled, 3 people lay dead. 2 of them, Army Sergeant Kenneth Ford and another U.S. serviceman, were Americans. Over 200 others were injured, many critically, their lives permanently scarred. The horror of that night reverberated far beyond Berlin. Within hours, the U.S. intelligence apparatus went into overdrive. Signals were intercepted. German authorities combed through debris, hunting for forensic evidence. Clues began to converge, and the conclusion was swift and damning. The bombing was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted strike, orchestrated by Libyan intelligence agents and executed via operatives working out of the Libyan People's Bureau in East Berlin, an embassy in name only, but in practice, a terrorist command center. Intercepted communications provided the final confirmation. NSA and West German intelligence traced orders flowing from Tripoli to East Berlin. The Labelle bombing was a state-sponsored act of terrorism, a declaration of war in all but name. And this time, the evidence was ironclad. There was no doubt, no room for diplomatic hedging. Gaddafi's fingerprints were all over the carnage. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan, already a vocal and steadfast critic of Gaddafi, received the intelligence briefing with grim focus. The attack at Labelle was not just an atrocity. It was a provocation too far. Reagan had watched Gaddafi's provocations escalate over the years. He had warned more than once that the United States would respond decisively if Americans were targeted. Now, with 2 dead servicemen and over 200 injured civilians, many of them allies, he had the political and moral justification he needed. There would be no more patience, no more warnings, no more red lines. "This is not an isolated incident," Reagan declared to his advisors during a high-level Situation Room meeting. "This is part of a clear pattern. We cannot afford to wait for the next bomb, the next body, the next American casualty." The decision to retaliate was not taken lightly. Within the Pentagon, war planners began reviewing strike packages. Military attachés coordinated with European allies, even as political fallout loomed. In the public eye, Reagan projected calm resolve. But behind closed doors, the machinery of retribution was grinding into motion. Air Force and Navy commanders received sealed orders. Intelligence assets mapped Libyan military installations with precision. The target list grew. Airfields, radar stations, command centers, terrorist training camps. But for Reagan, this was not just about military targets. It was about sending a message. The United States would no longer tolerate state-sponsored terrorism. The era of appeasement was over. The fuse had been lit at Labelle, and now it was only a matter of time before fire followed. The operation that would eventually shake Tripoli to its core began not with explosions, but with endless hours of planning, precision, and geopolitical frustration. Officially, it bore the code name El Dorado Canyon, but in some military circles it was also referred to as Prairie Fire, a moniker befitting the scorched earth intent of the mission. For the United States, this was more than a retaliation. It was a full-spectrum demonstration of Cold War-era joint force doctrine, a rare and daring coordination between the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force executed under the most challenging conditions. The stakes could not have been higher. President Ronald Reagan had made the political decision. America would strike. Now, it fell to the military to translate that intent into reality. A calibrated use of force that would devastate Libya's terrorist infrastructure while minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding wider regional war. The Pentagon understood the enormity of the task. Libya was no superpower, but it had Soviet-supplied defenses, hardened facilities, and an unpredictable leader who wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. The operational concept behind El Dorado Canyon was both audacious and technically complex. It called for simultaneous high-speed, precision strikes on multiple Libyan targets. These were not random military installations, they were nodes in a network that stretched from Tripoli to Benghazi and beyond. The targets included radar stations, airfields that served as hubs for Libya's Soviet-built MiG fighters and Tupolev bombers, and command and control facilities thought to be directing Libyan-backed terrorist operations across Europe. Most significant of all was Bab al-Azizia, the heavily fortified military compound and personal residence of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. This wasn't just a symbolic blow. U.S. intelligence assessed that Bab al-Azizia functioned as the nerve center of Gaddafi's regime. Underground bunkers, barracks, a military communications array, and possible command tunnels made it more than a residence. It was the beating heart of his power. Taking it out would not only shock the regime, it might cripple its ability to coordinate further acts of terror. The plan demanded nothing short of flawless synchronization between the Air Force and the Navy. The Navy had a clear logistical advantage. 2 aircraft carriers, USS Coral Sea and USS America, were already stationed in the Mediterranean. Their FA-18 Hornets, a 6E Intruders, and EA-6B Prowlers could be launched within striking distance of the Libyan coast, supported by E-2 Hawkeyes and other surveillance assets. Their job would be to suppress enemy air defenses, conduct reconnaissance, and deliver ordnance to critical radar and anti-aircraft sites in Benghazi and the eastern coast. But for the western targets, including the prized Bab al-Azizia compound in Tripoli, the responsibility would fall to the Air Force. And this is where the mission's complexity soared to daunting new heights. The Air Force's strike package would be built around the F-11F Aardvark, a supersonic tactical bomber designed for long-range, low-level penetration. 13 of these aircraft, along with 4 111 Raven electronic warfare planes, would launch from RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom. But there was a problem. One that would strain the mission's timeline, range, and risk profile: overflight rights. America's European allies, wary of inflaming tensions in the Arab world or provoking Soviet countermeasures, were not eager to play host to a direct military strike on a sovereign Arab state. France, in particular, dealt a serious blow to the plan by denying overflight permission. Spain followed suit. This forced U.S. war planners to chart a route that was significantly longer and more complicated. Instead of flying over southern Europe and crossing the Mediterranean directly into Libya, the F-111s would have to head west, then south over the Atlantic, around the Iberian Peninsula, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and then east into the Mediterranean, only then approaching the Libyan coast from the sea. This detour added more than 1,300 nautical miles to the mission profile, turning what should have been a 6 to 7 hour mission into a grueling 14-hour round trip. To make this work, the Air Force would need an unprecedented ballet of support assets. Aerial refueling would be required, twice on the way in and again on the return. KC-10 extenders and KC-135 Strato tankers were dispatched in waves to create a mobile fuel corridor for the bombers. Timing was everything. Each rendezvous had to be nailed with absolute precision, or an F-111 risked ditching in the sea, far from help. The mission profile itself was equally daring. To avoid Libyan radar and Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile systems, the F-111s would fly at extremely low altitude, skimming the waves at less than 500 feet above sea level. At such altitudes, a moment's inattention or a technical glitch could mean instant death. The pilots would have to navigate, communicate, evade radar, and deliver their weapons, all while traveling at near supersonic speeds in pitch blackness over unfamiliar waters. Adding to the danger was the political volatility of the region. Libyan air defenses, although not cutting-edge by NATO standards, were formidable. They included Soviet-made SA-2 and SA-5 missile systems, radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, and interceptor aircraft stationed at multiple bases. Intelligence indicated that Libyan MiGs were on heightened alert following the Berlin bombing and expected some form of American retaliation. If detected early, the incoming F-111s would be sitting ducks for a coordinated defense. To reduce that risk, the Navy's role was even more critical. Hours before the Air Force's bombers reached the Libyan coast, Navy attack jets from USS Coral Sea and USS America would launch preemptive strikes against Libya's air defense radar installations in Benghazi. This was known as SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, and it was intended to blind Libya's early warning systems, distract command structures, and confuse Gaddafi's air force long enough for the main strike package to hit Tripoli with impunity. It was a textbook example of joint force doctrine, but one that had rarely been executed in actual combat. Communications had to be seamless. Radar jamming had to be timed to the second. And above all, both branches of the military had to trust that the other would fulfill their role at the right moment, without fail. From war rooms in Washington and command centers across Europe, the operation was tracked with the intensity of a full-scale war. Satellites watched the Libyan coast. AWACS planes monitored the skies. Naval commanders coordinated strike waves down to the minute. Every contingency had been war-gamed, every threat analyzed. And still, it came down to brave men in cockpits, flying thousands of miles into harm's way to carry out an order from their commander-in-chief. The logistical challenges were immense. The stakes were global. The risk of failure was real. But the message was clear. The United States would not let terrorism go unanswered. 2 aircraft carriers spearheaded the strike: USS America, CV-66, and USS Coral Sea, CV-43. From the steel expanses of their decks, the most advanced warplanes of their day prepared for what would be the most dangerous and politically charged night of their careers. These floating airfields, each the size of a small city, buzzed with coordinated tension as flight crews armed jets, checked targeting packages, and loaded precision-guided munitions into weapons bays under red-lit conditions meant to preserve night vision. Lined up on the carrier's flight decks were sleek, deadly aircraft. FA-18 Hornets, versatile in both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. A 6E Intruders, designed for long-range, low-level bombing with pinpoint accuracy. And EA-6B Prowlers, electronic warfare platforms armed with sophisticated jamming equipment and anti-radiation missiles. Each aircraft had a defined role to play in the coming storm, and each crew knew that failure could unravel the entire operation. Accompanying the 2 flat tops were a dozen escort vessels. This formidable strike group included Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers like USS Yorktown and USS Richmond K. Turner, Spruance-class destroyers, and Knox-class frigates. Armed with advanced radar, Phalanx CIWS, and the newly operational Tomahawk cruise missiles, these ships formed an overlapping shield of electronic eyes and defensive teeth. They were there to defend the carriers, jam Libyan tracking systems, suppress enemy air defenses from afar, and, if needed, launch their own precision attacks. Together, these warships moved deliberately into the Gulf of Sidra, a contested zone Gaddafi had declared off-limits to foreign powers, what he called his line of death. For the 3rd time in that turbulent year, the U.S. Navy crossed it. The first 2 incursions had been shows of force and probing actions, testing Libyan responses. This time, there would be no testing. This was war, sanctioned with finality. At exactly 200 hours local time on April 15, 1986, the order was executed. In the space of moments, the stillness of the Mediterranean night erupted into a symphony of destruction. From the west, deep over the horizon, came the muffled, bone-rattling rumble of United States Air Force F-11F aardvarks. Flying at treetop level under the cover of darkness, they had journeyed over 3,000 miles from RAF Lakenheath, navigating a maze of aerial refueling and mid-air coordination. Their terrain-following radar allowed them to stay beneath Libyan air defenses, arriving undetected until the very last moment. Electronic countermeasures provided by EF-111A Ravens created a blanket of confusion over the Libyan radar network. Simultaneously, from the south and east, jets from USS Coral Sea and America took flight in tight formations. Launching from the carrier decks at night, a feat of precision and discipline, these aircraft soared into the blackness, coordinating with Navy AWACS and E-2 Hawkeye command and control planes. As they closed in on their targets, the night sky lit up with the spectral flashes of HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, launches. Leading the aerial onslaught were the EA-6B Prowlers, their mission, blind Libya's integrated air defense system. Armed with powerful AN/AL Q-99 jammers and AGM-88 HARM missiles, the Prowlers loosed wave after wave of electronic interference, sending Libyan radar screens into chaos. SAM sites went offline. Early warning radars went dark. Libyan operators were left blind and guessing as the rest of the strike force screamed in behind the electronic curtain. Next came the A-6 Intruders, flying low and fast, hugging the terrain at perilously low altitudes. As they approached their designated targets, radar installations, SA-5 SAM sites, and communication hubs, they released their payloads with surgical precision. Laser-guided bombs and cluster munitions exploded on impact, tearing apart Libya's air defense grid piece by piece. Overhead, FA-18 Hornets swept the skies, ready to engage any Libyan fighters that dared to intercept. Though there was no major dogfight, the Hornets' presence deterred any would-be defenders and guaranteed air superiority for the strike. Then came the moment of highest stakes. Over Tripoli, the sprawling Bab al-Azizia compound came into view. A maze of reinforced buildings, underground bunkers, military offices, and Gaddafi's own residence, it was considered the brain of the Libyan regime. Multiple aircraft rolled in, bombs ready, targeting command centers and key military infrastructure. Explosions lit up the night as wave after wave of ordnance pummeled the complex. Inside the compound, chaos reigned. Reports would later indicate that Colonel Gaddafi was in the building when the attack began, though the full extent of his movements remains a matter of historical ambiguity. What is known is that he survived, barely. Some accounts suggest he fled just minutes before the first bombs fell, alerted by intercepts or intuition. His escape was a narrow one, but not everyone in the compound was so fortunate. Several of Gaddafi's personal bodyguards were killed in the initial blasts, and among the casualties was a young girl, reportedly his adopted daughter, whose death would become the focal point of Libyan propaganda for decades to follow. The tragedy of a child caught in the crossfire, amplified by Libyan state media, stirred international outrage and became a permanent scar in the long and violent history between Gaddafi and the West. As the last jets roared away and returned to their carriers or began the long flight back to England, the Libyan capital lay smoldering. Radar stations were obliterated, air defense networks were crippled, command centers were in disarray. Though Gaddafi had survived, the message had been delivered, in fire and steel. This was El Dorado Canyon, America's answer to terrorism on state soil. And it was only the beginning of a new era in modern warfare. Libya's Soviet-supplied air defenses responded with fury but little effect. Surface-to-air missiles fired blindly into the sky, chasing ghosts on jamming screens. Libyan MiG-23s scrambled but failed to intercept. The American pilots, trained in the crucible of Cold War realism, danced through the chaos with discipline and firepower. Despite the intensity of the strike, losses were minimal. One F-111 was shot down near Tripoli. Both crewmen, pilot Captain Paul F. Lawrence and weapons officer Captain Fernando Ribas Dominici, were killed. The rest returned safely. The mission was over in minutes. The impact lasted for years. Across the Arab world, reactions were mixed. Some nations condemned the strike as imperial aggression, Others, weary of Gaddafi's recklessness, remained silent. In Europe, allies winced at the boldness but privately admired the precision. At home, Reagan's approval soared. Libya reeled. Gaddafi, stunned and humiliated, scaled back his global ambitions. For years, Libya's overt sponsorship of terrorism waned. Western intelligence noted a steep decline in activity tied to Libyan operatives. The message had been received, loud and clear. Operation Prairie Fire, as the Navy called it, marked a turning point in modern military doctrine. It was a demonstration of reach, coordination, and raw willpower. It showcased the flexibility of naval aviation, the punch of joint operations, and the high price of provoking a superpower. For the sailors and pilots involved, it was a night etched into memory. A test of nerves, a clash of machines, a dance of missiles and men. And for the United States, it was a reminder: the oceans may be vast, but none are beyond reach.